with this session, a panel discussion on crisis COVID-19 and new contingencies of agentic citizenship in Europe. There are three of us that are going to present to you our work today. That's Simon Goodman, myself, Kesi, Mahendran, and then Eleni Andreouli will close off the panel discussion. Simon, Eleni, and I know each other very well. We work with each other a whole bunch of times. We're all social and political psychologists based in the UK. But what we wanted to do this time is to kind of present to you some of the work that we've done really individually, actually, although it's all very complementary, and hopefully you'll see those horizontals when we get started. Things have changed for citizenship, and as Eleni will talk about at the end, you could even say that citizenship is now suspended citizenship. One of the big things that's happening, I think, is the stay-at-home message has really, which is occurring right across the world, it has really challenged the notion of active citizenship. And what Simon will talk about is how that plays out for migrants and refugees who've always had to demonstrate their behavior. The onus is on them is to perform certain competencies in terms of integration. And then what I'm going to talk about is home, the concept of home. I have to say that we started working on the home paper last year, having no idea that this was coming around the corner and that home was going to take on such signification. So without going on too much, what I'd like to do then is pass over to Simon Goodman to talk about how citizenship for refugees is, what ways refugees are expected to behave in the context of this COVID pandemic and indeed before it. Hey, thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Right, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully it's all right. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see me clearly. Yeah, thank you for coming along today. I'm really glad to be part of this panel. And as Kesi said, I'm going to be talking about citizenship, how that's featured in two crises. I'm going to be talking really more about the refugee crisis, but also obviously it's impossible not to talk about the ongoing COVID-related crisis as well. And exactly what I'm going to be talking about is a way in which refugees' citizenship is contingent on them behaving in particular ways. As we're going to see, that there's, I'll say a little bit about the context and background, and then I'm going to show you how the crisis, the refugee crisis, was presented as a crisis not for refugees, but for the European countries that were affected by the crisis, thereby citizenship being really denied to the refugees. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about some work I've done looking at how refugees are presented as needing to integrate to British values in order to really earn their citizenship. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the movement that's happened during the more recent crisis, where this exclusionary approach to migrants more broadly, this doesn't really just focus on refugees, is being used to challenge this more exclusionary approach. So the approach I'm taking is a discursive rhetorical approach. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but you'll see the interest is on what is achieved through the language, the arguments that are made, rather than what do they tell us about what people actually necessarily believe themselves. There's quite a lot of discursive work that's looked at anti-refugee arguments. A really common one is this idea of a natural disaster metaphor. So often you'll see talk about floods or waves of refugees, and all this presents refugees as being a really serious threat. There's lots of interesting category work. So for example, there used to be quite a big link between the bogus and the genuine asylum seekers. That category work's changed a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about different categories that were used in the refugee crisis in a moment. And often what you can see is that opposing refugees is seen as being kind of for a liberal aim. So it's perhaps to protect social cohesion or prevent extremists from taking advantage of the situation. I'm going to be talking about integration and how that relates to citizenship. Now, there is some discursive work already that looks at concepts like integration. Already we can see that often anti-refugee arguments are framed around this kind of lack of ability to integrate. So refugees might be presented as potential terrorists. This overlaps a lot with a lot of the Islamophobia that really overlaps with some of the anti-refugee arguments. And it's already been noted that the supposed lack of integration by refugees is often attributed to cultural differences. And again, that's used to exclude refugees from moving into a host country. Now, a little bit of background around the refugee crisis. I think everybody's familiar with this. What was different about the refugee crisis is that a lot of the standard anti-refugee arguments, which are based around refugees not really needing support because they're just coming to the country for financial gain, looking at the footage of what was happening in Syria every evening in the news, made a lot of those arguments were more difficult to make, but a lot of them surprisingly still persisted. So David Cameron, who when he was still Prime Minister of the UK, he referred to swarm of migrants and a bunch of migrants. So you can see dehumanizing language was used throughout the crisis. Now, some work I did that I think is really relevant for citizenship is looked at the different ways in which the crisis was presented. And what you can see is there were a number of different ways in which the crisis was presented, but it was never a crisis for the refugees. So we had a Mediterranean migrant crisis, a Calais migrant crisis. Really notably is we've got Europe's migrant crisis. So it was a crisis for Europe, for us, and very much the refugees were presented as not being part of us. So they were excluded from any kind of possible citizenship. Okay, very much a kind of a clear us and them distinction. Now, did some more work looking more specifically at integration in the context of the refugee crisis. Really, the overarching research question here was, what is the talk about integrating refugees doing during the refugee crisis? Drawing some UK newspaper data, so this is all in the UK context. I need to credit my co-author on this work, Steve Kirkwood at Edinburgh. And what we showed is that there were a number of different arguments and dilemmas that were used as sort of an argument either for inclusion or exclusion of refugees. And the ones that I'm going to be talking about today are this idea that integration is positive, but it can be challenging. This idea that host communities are presented as welcoming, but also there's a limit to the extent to which they're able to be welcoming. And really importantly, I think, around the idea of citizenship is the idea that good refugees integrate and bad ones don't. And what we'll see, so the examples I've got are all from UK newspapers. The first one here is from David Finkelstein. This was in the Times newspaper. And you can see, hopefully you can see this clearly, is the heading says, here's what we really think about migrants. He goes on to say, this country has a proud tradition of welcoming refugees, but in return, they have to live by Britain's liberal values. Okay, so for a start, anyone who's looked at any arguments around refugees will see that you always get this idea that the host country is a welcoming country. That's always followed by a but, just like you see here. And the but here is that they have to live by Britain's liberal values. Okay, now this is quite a clever argument, because firstly, it's saying that that right to be here, that right to citizenship is contingent on adhering to those values. Okay, quite interesting they talk about Britain's liberal values, because of course in making this argument, this is actually an illiberal argument, but it's drawing on the notion of liberalism to actually make this kind of contingency by which refugees are allowed to kind of gain citizenship. Again, this idea, we see further this idea that host communities are presented as welcoming, but they're limited to the extent to which they're welcomed. So this example here comes from the Daily Mail, again, not famous for being particularly supportive of refugees. So you can see here, most people in Britain and the rest of Europe, faced with pictures of desperate people, do feel compassion, and many act on it as individuals by donating to charities. Again, you get the but bit, which comes next, but most of us want to be generous without encouraging further flows and without damaging our own country's social infrastructure with unsustainably large inflows of people. So again, you're getting this argument that, if too many people come in, that's going to make us less able to be welcoming. So we've got this kind of this British value of welcomingness, but if we welcome too many people, we're not going to be able to be welcoming. So this is quite a circular argument, but it also has the effect of saying, well, you know, highlighting the liberalism, the welcomingness, the openness of the country, while also making quite a fairly strong argument for preventing people from coming into the country as well. And then you can really see this argument around integration really kind of, I think, most kind of clearly illustrated in this example here. So this is again in the Daily Mail from another right-wing commentator, Richard Littlejohn. And you can see what he's saying here is there is a sizable, voluble minority which has no intention of assimilating and constantly demands that this country should be reordered to comply with their political prejudice and religious doctrine. And it's very clear in all of these cases, it's Muslims in particular that are the problem here. Okay, I've never had any objection to managed immigration or multicultural society. It's multiculturalism, which is so dangerous. The policy that insists the host community must adapt to suit the newcomers. What we can see here is some really quite interesting work around this idea of integration. Okay, firstly, there's this idea that people need to be, they've got no intention of assimilating, which is a very specific version of integration, a one-way version of integration, where the people coming into the country totally take on board the values of the host country without maintaining any of their ongoing values, which is what integration would be. And this idea that integration could be a two-way process is presented here as massively problematic, because he's saying what he's taking issue with here is a policy that insists that host communities must adapt to suit the newcomers. So again, what we're seeing here very clearly is this idea that refugees have a right to citizenship only if they behave in a particular way, and the way that's required here is through assimilation, so doing exactly what the host community is doing. And these arguments are quite consistently used in sort of anti-refugee and more broadly in anti-migrant rhetoric. I'm going to shift now from the refugee crisis onto the more recent COVID-19 crisis. And what we can see happening here, and like I said, this applies to migrants more broadly than refugees, is that we're having a change here. What we're seeing is that some migrant groups who've been quite visible in kind of the fight against the virus have come together to show how important they are. So they put together a video. I've put the link, actually it's at the end of the links here, it's at the end of the talk as well. But you can see that they put together basically a poem. You can watch the video, it's worth having a look on YouTube. And what you can say is, I'll just read the end bit here, but they say, now you clap for me, you cheer as I toil, bringing food to your family, bringing food from your soil, propping up your hospitals, not some foreign invader, delivery driver, teacher, lifesaver. So what we can see here is that these migrant groups are coming together and saying, you know, you're suggesting that we don't make a valuable contribution to the country, but clearly we do. And now at a time of crisis, it's been shown that migrant workers, often doctors, nurses, but also working in really other important occupations in the UK, have been shown to be really, really important. So what you can see is they're challenging this idea that there needs to be this kind of basis on which they're allowed into the country. And what they're doing is they're showing that they are of some use. So just to sum up, hopefully I'm still in time here, we can see we've got the two different crises. So we've had the refugee crisis and the pandemic crisis, and they both kind of created a space where there's a discussion for citizenship for refugees and migrants in the case of the UK. So I think what I've shown is that in the refugee crisis, this is a crisis for Europe. And this is very much exclusive towards refugees. What I have shown is that refugees are expected to assimilate in order to kind of earn their citizenship. And if they don't do this, then they're not entitled to settle in the country. Okay, and particularly this was kind of directed at Muslims coming from Syria and elsewhere. But what we've seen is in the pandemic crisis, that's allowed space to have some opposition to this broader anti-migrant narrative by showing that actually these people are making an important contribution to citizenship. But even this argument is still based on the idea that these migrants are behaving in a suitable way, in that they're kind of making the necessary contributions. So what it doesn't do is entirely challenge this notion that people from outside of the country can only enter the country if they're behaving in a particular way. Okay, so I hope you have kept the time. That's what I want to say. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Simon. That's perfect timing, and we kept completely to time. So as we said, for those of you people who are joining just now, that we'll take all the questions at the end, and I'll share my screen with you now. Okay, so my name, as I say, is Kesi Mahendran, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about populism, threat, and the people's representations of home. I mean, it's been a really interesting conference actually so far, and I feel that these conversations have begun. I didn't get a chance to see the panel earlier on today on home, but certainly we'll look at it on YouTube. So what I'd like to do then is talk about populism and the true people, and how populism works really by articulating just some of the people as the true people. And by doing that, just really as Simon has just been saying, there's a whole process by which other people are effectively unhomed by that process, even though they live in the country in question. And then I want to talk about how our work works in terms of analysing the concept home. So we really do go into the analytical category of home, and by looking at that, we've found that there are three different ways, three different common senses on home, if you like. We use the theory of social representations to do this. So birthplace, life course, and threatened space. So I'm going to bring up the UK case and Boris Johnson's campaign to win the general election, which happened in December last year. He was successful, and part of his success was to do with a rhetorical move of taking EU migrants and making this statement. EU migrants have been able to treat the UK as if it's part of their home country for too long. It's quite fascinating the way he does this, because in a way, I think people who come to the UK, certainly from the European Union, probably didn't even think of themselves as migrants, actually. Excuse me. And yet they're framed as EU migrants, acting as if they're in their own home. And we see this idea. I would draw your attention to the use of the words too long. That temporal element is important to the success of populism, as I'm going to show you. So the work that I do is about dialogue between citizens and the governments. And as I was saying to Eleni and Simon earlier on, just before we started, when I rehearsed this talk, it was way over the allocated 15 minutes. So I'll jump a few slides fairly quickly, but you can slow them down if you're watching on YouTube. So I work on dialogue between citizens and governments by sort of de-reifying the government, which, you know, I want to propose to you is full of human beings, and also then kind of making citizens more political and the sort of inner politician in all of us. I use Dewey's notion of public capacity to talk about that situation where we are oriented towards the other, that when we speak, we are minded of the fact that our words and our actions impact on other people. So it's that public capacity, or what Hannah Arendt talked about as enlarged mentality, that we do in our studies. We design them, first of all, to bring people into dialogue with government policies and government actors in order to get them to orient as dialogical citizens. So semiotic mediation has been, Luca's, excuse me, Luca Tatea's talk is on YouTube, and his papers, especially the one Atmosphere, is a great example of semiotic mediation if you become interested in it. But here's it's a fancy expression, isn't it? But really it's showing how we use signs to communicate, and we're picking up on, we sort of feel our way into signs. And one of the signs we've got in the UK at the moment is stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. You will see that the sign has been created like a hazard sign. It's got a yellow background, black writing, use of red, and then of course all those lines that are around the outside are almost like you're driving through life or you're in a hazardous workplace. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives has been the message in the UK context. But Barton says that the dialogical imagination has this embattled tendency in the life of language between two forces: the centralized force, which is the official discourse, which is unified, but it's always naturally being re-territorialized by centrifugal forces, a process of decentralization and disunification, which it often uses parody. And together that creates this contradiction-ridden, tension-filled unity then of these two embattled tendencies within language. So if we have the stay-at-home message, we've just talking about earlier on when we met earlier on in the session, that we have a scandal going on in the UK regarding a senior advisor who basically doesn't seem to have got the stay-at-home message and travelled 260 miles right down the length of England in order to stay on his father's estate. This has infuriated people who've made enormous sacrifices by taking the message really, really literally. The government is standing beside their advisor, and they are taking the rhetorical argument that he did follow the rules, he interpreted the rules using his individual judgment. People then begin a process of centrifugal. So in no time at all, within social media, the new message: stay elite, protect Cummings, save career. Cummings gave a long speech where he explained that much of his driving, he was spotted in a beautiful place actually called Barnard Castle on the days when he should have been at home, and he made the claim that he was out driving to Barnard Castle because he wanted to test his eyes. He thought his eyes weren't working properly, and he thought the best way to test them was to drive to Barnard Castle with his wife and young 4-year-old son. This led to this one: can't see, go for a drive, risk lives. And this is what human beings can do. They can immediately have a tendency, a compulsion almost, to take apart messages that are rapidly losing authority. Populism works then by using, I don't need to tell you this really, a good versus evil binary. The two features of populism that have been sort of analysed are the vertical one, the one between that we just saw it there, the people coming back against the elite. But populist leaders, this is the difficulty that the UK government has, and indeed the American government has, and populist leaders have at the moment, is that they're sounding rather elite, whereas the whole point is that they were supposed to be on side with the people. And then on the horizontal dimension, the true people versus immigrants. In terms of the way populism works, in terms of ramping up the temperature, it creates a sort of hyper-partisanship and an antagonistic reasoning. And I would draw your attention to Robert Singh's paper. There's Nick Rose's paper, Bird on the Wire, is absolutely brilliant on this. And Robert Singh's I, the People is also very good, using the Trump American case of the populist leaders. And he shows that Trump doesn't really see himself as engaged in direct democracy. He doesn't really see himself as engaged in representing the people. He believes he is the people. I am the people. So he removes all the distance between himself and the people. Populist acts then create a sort of new common sense, this unhoming, where certain sections of the public are seen to be in tension with citizenship by the very fact that they move. So citizenship becomes static, and just the very fact of movement creates this sort of tension around cohesion. You know, Simon was talking about Richard Littlejohn and the Battle of Britain, you know, an example, quite a nice example of that. But the key thing is that actually the reality is that we've had movement and quite a high level of freedom of movement for decades, right across Europe, since Maastricht Treaty. So these temporalities are really key. It's a slightly detailed slide. I apologize for that. But the key point to pull out from this slide is one that you can see this in Moles and Jetton's papers, actually, if you want to get into, and also Capellos and Castanado and Moffat and Tormey. But it creates the nationalist populist triad is to set up a golden past, a threatened present, which is stalled. The project has stalled. And as Simon was showing, that notice how Richard Littlejohn used the Battle of Britain, you know, as a particular moment in the Second World War. It is a glorious moment. So he very key use of the glorious moment of the past to talk about the present as being problematic. And then you propose effectively the possibility of a golden future, but it is for some. That's the key thing. It's for the true people only. And you can use reactionary psychological orientations, or what Capellos and colleagues are now talking about as ressentiments, you know, this kind of resentful form of belonging, but lots of affect there. So does it work? Well, in the work that we've done, the assumption here is that there's high levels of conformity, and that we do go with the crowd. We do listen, even, you know, via identifications and so on and so forth. We're influenced by what the crowd or our version of what the public thinks. But actually, increasingly, the work that we're doing under the heading of meta-representation shows that actually simply isn't the case. So Emma O'Dwyer, in just published this year, actually, a paper called Reading the Public. If you take a look at that paper, it's in Political Psychology. The volume number is not assigned yet, actually, but it's online. What she shows by taking the Brexit case and Remainers in the Brexit case is in orienting themselves towards their own positions on UK-EU relationships, they have to take a view on the public, and that view is not straightforward acceptance or rejection. It's a process of saying, well, the thing about the public is they're a bit this, they're a bit that. So they develop a kind of common sense on the public, a social representation, if you like, of the public. In our work, my work, 2018, I showed that representation we have of the public is not necessarily oppositional either. It's not us and them. Sometimes you might see yourself as ahead of the public. And I identified 6 positions on the public. One was regarding yourself to be ahead of the public, which is a kind of avant-garde position. Another one was an advocating position. So you talked about a they, but a very sympathetic use of the word they. And then there is an oppositional distancing and so on. I set out 6 in that paper. So here we're starting to get a slightly thicker understanding of how the public behave. Let's bring on the home concept then. Home is, it's amazing that we don't do more studies. I mean, feminist scholars do work on home, but other than feminist scholars looking at the constraint of home, and we all notice how, I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day, and I said, it's funny, isn't it? The one thing that didn't have the word self in front was schooling. That managed to become homeschooling, didn't it? It wasn't going to be self-schooling, of course. And we know already that, of course, that so much of that work has affected people, parents basically, you know, having to divide their time between the task of homeschooling and doing the day job. But so home is used politically in this primordial way as a refuge, self-stabilizing, security, unchanging and constant. But of course, if you bring in a more feminist analysis, you can see the constraint around the concept of home as well. I would draw your attention to Jennifer Mitson, who's written a brilliant paper in the special issue, which we were all part. Eleni also put a paper into that special issue. So that's quite, if you're interested in this stuff, you'll get a lot just by all of the papers in that special issue of political psychology. So the question then, look at that, 10 minutes and I haven't even got to the question, but here it is. It's, what is the relationship between populist leaders' implicit and explicit use of home and the people's social representations of home? So it is a forthcoming article between myself and my 2 PhD students working with me, Anthony English and Sue Neeland. These are the existing measures of home. I won't talk about them too much, but they're out there. Unsurprisingly, they're survey-led using existing survey questions about people, elite, experts, the usual sorts of thing. No questions on home, I'm afraid. Our program then is about understanding categories of citizenship, migration, and belonging. As I said before, this is me in a shopping centre just before the European Brexit referendum, talking to people, and you can see I've given her a stimulus, and she's using. I mean, she's just holding it in her hand at that point, and now she's telling me what she thinks and so on. This we made a film. It's on YouTube if you want to have a look at it. And the study's actually been in 3 phases. It started quite a way back now. It feels like it's over a decade ago. So 2008, it was in Edinburgh and Stockholm. By 2012-13, which is the data we're using for this paper, it was in Dublin, Düsseldorf, Glasgow, Gothenburg, and London. And the newest study 3, is in Edinburgh, Manchester, and Stockholm. And thankfully, fieldwork all completed before the lockdown. At the same time, in the 3rd phase, I have as I say, 2 PhDs working with me that I'll introduce to you, and in future conferences they'll be presenting. So that's Anthony English and Sue Nealand. Anthony is looking at consensus and dissensus in political decision making. His preoccupation and what we're trying to make some contribution to is how you sustain dialogue with someone who you really quite strongly disagree with. So we're using I positionals within the dialogical self to see if there are I positions there that you know, Anthony is working on that just now again, thankfully, having done his field work before the lockdown. For the 1st phase, and then he will bring people into pairs, dyads, to see if they can sustain dialogue when there's a pretty big difference of opinion. Sue is looking at the political decision making of the silent generation. They are now people who are 75 plus, but the key thing is this is a generation that can remember the war, and as has been talked about already at this conference, there has been enormous ageism around this pandemic and the 70 plus age group. And we have a problem with public opinion poll data, which is that it has a 65 plus category. So it collapses and aggregates a whole group of people, ranging from people in their 60s all the way through to people in their 90s. So Sue will be looking at that. Okay, so we use a migration mobility continuum that I developed over the years. And the key thing to say about that is it's not a binary. It has people at 10 different positions, from generational non-mobility all the way through to serial migration. See if we can get some data then. As I say, 3 social representations of home emerged in our analysis. It is a paper, by the way. It's just gone back. It was a revise, and so it's gone back to the journal. So I'm avoiding sort of presenting it because it would compromise that final process on it. But the key thing is, if you want it, then just contact me and we can send it out to you because it's ready to go now. We find that when people do home, not populist leaders, the people do home, they talk about birthplace, i.e. the hegemonic one, but they also talk about it as homemaking across a life course. They have internalized the threatened space and the threat message, but it really isn't anywhere near as straightforward. And the key thing I would say is that it occurs, these 3 representations occur right across the migration mobility continuum. So movement is not playing the way the populists' unhoming practices suggest. There is something about an existential uncertainty within our sense of home. We are active in our process of homemaking. I'm just going to give you one slide because I can see the time. So I'm just going to give you one slide then. This is one participant, JS. I interviewed him in Gothenburg. He was originally from Finland, but he lived in Gothenburg really since he was a young man. So yes, but my citizenship is Finland. It's about here, something more. He's putting his hand on his chest and I'm saying in the heart. Yes, in the heart. And Swedish citizenship is because I live here. And I want to be a citizen, you know, as Eleni will talk about, I want to be a citizen where I live. It does not have to do anything with my feelings, making a distinction there. But the other passport, and don't ask me why, notice the rhetorical skill, don't ask me why, because I don't know. But Finland, I want to be buried there. I'm born there, and my passport is very important, even if I'm not Finnish either. I am Roma people. we don't have any passports. If there was a Roma passport, I'd like to have that passport. And notice how he uses birth. He goes back to his birth, he goes to the present. And then, as Molly Andrews was talking in her talk, which is available on YouTube, about this kind of failure of narrative imagination. Well, here you see the opposite. You see this ideal, imaginative, possible citizenship future where you could have a passport when you're Roma. So this is a slightly different one. I'm conscious of time, so I won't do this one. But the only thing I'll draw your attention to is that someone in MMC position 1, i.e., generation no mobility, but actually going through exactly the same dialectic process. And what I want to say to you is this: that people actively make themselves at home using intergenerational and transnational dialogue, just like he did then. Social representations of home relate to birthplace, life course, threatened space, past, present, and imagined futures, and that national populism succeeds by using a protectionist version of home, which we find not to be present in our study. I haven't shown you too much of it, but it is the case. But I think it continues to succeed because we're not having this conversation. Home remains a very unexamined concept. Thank you. So I'll pass now to Eleni, who's going to give us the final talk then, and that's on, let me just stop sharing my screen. Yeah, so I'll pass to Eleni now, and she's going to talk about suspended citizenship, construction of citizenship during the COVID-19 emergency.
Hi, thank you, Kesi. My screen. I have to apologize. Stops. I've been disconnected a few times already. I do apologize in advance if that happens again. Let me now share my screen. Okay. Right. I hope that you can all hear me. Right. So thanks, Kesi and Simon, for your talks. I think I was able to get most of it. Now, my talk is going to be on suspended citizenship, constructions of citizenship during the COVID-19 crisis in the UK. So this is a project I am ideas that I'm developing. By no means is dynamic approach to citizenship. As a social psychologist, I take it to be a practice and not really abstract, and also that we negotiate in our everyday lives and in different kind of communicative. So something that just exists, that was we achieve. So citizenship in my view, the political goes far beyond so I take citizenship to be both conventional, it's forms of a citizenship regime. So going and voting, for example, okay? So you enact your So,
Looks like we've lost you a bit, Eleni.
I've just realized that I'm not quite sure where the connection.
Yeah, your connection, it was fine earlier on actually, but now it's breaking in and out.
Okay, what was the last thing?
You'd got to Susan Condor, contested citizenship was the last one, where I saw the slide actually come up.
Okay. Oh, that's not that bad. Thank you and apologies. Right, this convergence is something that with Paul Stenner and David C. Disruptions in the political status quo.
It's actually frozen again, Eleni. Do you want to have a shot at logging in again, joining again?
Also, if the internet connection doesn't work at all, we can offer to send a video and then we can merge it with the rest of the presentation and it will still be on YouTube. If the internet really bad.
Shall we see if anyone wants to ask any questions at this point, and then we'll play Eleni back in because it might be worth. Let's have a look at them. So it's an opportunity then to have a think about if you have any questions for us. There we go, Eleni actually is back. How you doing, Eleni? Gosh, that's frustrating, isn't it? Frustrating because it was working before, actually, when we were talking before, wasn't it? And then now it's out. Well, look, just yeah, let's go to the Q&A then, and then I'll make the offer to Eleni that Marsha's making. Thanks, Marsha. That we could get a video from Eleni of her talk and merge it into the YouTube version of it. How does that sound, Eleni? I can see you there is a sort of flicker of your connection, but we're just not getting the picture. We're just not getting that connection. So let's open the floor then, and we're happy to take questions on the Simon and my paper individually, or you may want to open up a bigger question about citizenship under these conditions during this COVID pandemic. Yeah, so that's just a message from Eleni now. She just texted me saying just to keep going without her, and then she'll send a video through.
It seems like there's no questions in the Q&A section.
Yeah, I can't see any. I just want to give everyone a few moments to kind of formulate a question. I liked your talk, Simon. I thought that was really interesting, and I could see synergies between what we've been doing actually in our work and the work that you've been doing. Although although I've heard you speak actually before, but I hadn't made those connections, I think, until we did this analysis on populism, which is that one of the ways that people succeed with making integration demands on refugees is to use these kind of temporal features, isn't it? They have to go back.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting that, I mean, obviously there's this idea of birthright, which is one of the things that's kind of being tapped into it. So that gives you automatic citizenship, no matter how you behave. But then if you don't have the birthright, you have to kind of negotiate it some other way, don't you?
Yeah, but ultimately you can't, which I think is the point that's being made in the video, isn't it? That you used as one of your closing slides. Ultimately, you can't succeed either. That if your starting point as a populist commentator is to go back, that many decades, then no newcomer can succeed in that. I notice that a lot of people now are telling the story of their, especially Commonwealth background people, are telling the story of their grandparents' involvement in the Second World War. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of that around VE Day, wasn't there? And again, yeah, that's a way of kind of managing that inclusiveness, isn't it? And kind of challenging this idea that, it's not just kind of on current behavior. So yeah, it does have that temporal dimension you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm becoming more and more aware of it. I mean, and I think that one of the things I think that COVID did as a moment was it, of course, slowed everything down massively.
Yeah.
Which created this. It's very present, isn't it? It's really forcing us to stay very present, which we're not very good at. We're good at going backwards and forwards. And
yeah, it's true. And I suppose that's where the migrants in that video were able to say, right now, we're of huge value. And that's why I suppose that video had so much value.
Had impact, yeah. I mean, exactly that, because it was right here, right now. You need us.
But it is still using the other terms of the debate, which is that it's about usefulness. So it's kind of, had they not been useful, that still wouldn't have been. They still wouldn't be entitled to citizenship. So it's still contingent on their being useful. Now, obviously, migrants can show very clearly that, make a massive contribution, but it's still kind of based on that, that requirement to have made that contribution rather than just to be here.
Yeah, it's very categorical, isn't it? That there's this whole notion of the good contributing migrant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got a question.
Yeah, let's have a wee look. Yeah, so this is coming from Paul then. Hi, Paul. it's a bit about the technical problems, but very interesting session. You mentioned the controversy over Dominic Cummings that's unfolding in the last few days. This is in the UK context. I wonder what you would have to say about how the social psychological aspects of this. Some prominent social psychologists have been involved, e.g. Steve Reicher, who's a social psychologist based also in the UK at St Andrews. I'd be interested to hear more about your views on that, the social psychological framing perhaps of what's going on with Dominic Cummings. Do you have a view, Simon?
I mean, I think what Steve Reich is saying about this is correct in my opinion. I think I think he's making a good case there that this is about the potential for this to undermine kind of the support for the idea. But I think what he said more recently as well is that actually what it's done is unite people against Dominic Cummings. So you now have you've got an odd situation. You've got the left-wing newspaper, well, leftish newspapers, the right-wing newspapers. They're all against Dominic Cummings, and it does seem that in a country that's been quite divided lately, we're now actually all quite united around kind of wanting Dominic Cummings gone. So I think that's important. But yeah, I mean, the whole crisis, I mean, obviously social psychology isn't the only discipline that's got important things to say about this crisis, but it's deeply social psychological, in terms of kind of complying with the guidance. And it's very much a group effort. And I think there's a lot of positive things to take from it, because actually, we're talking about the sacrifices that people are making, and you were talking, Kesi, about that kind of silent generation. And actually, much of what's happening is younger people taking a hit, making those sacrifices, so that we can collectively protect older people and more vulnerable people in the society. And that's actually a really good thing. That's a real great collectivism that we don't often see. So I think definitely, I mean, in answer to the question, definitely social psychology has got a huge amount to say about what's going on. Lots of negatives, but there are also some real positives that we can take from this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Thanks, Paul, for the question. I think it is. I think we have to be careful as social psychologists, and I think Steve Reicher also is. I recognise that he tweeted when he was, absolutely dismayed at the behaviour of the government in relation to Dominic Cummings' actions. And I think that the key thing I think happened in that moment was that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, defended Dominic by using notions of instinct, and he was doing what any father would do, and that of course did make the public very, very angry. It was that use of instinct, because of course we'd all been told precisely not to do that, and not to put our sort of individual decision making ahead of the group. But personally, I can meet Steve just about halfway on this one. I think it's social psychological, but I'm always wary when social psychologists put their lens on the public. I think that we need to be careful. The public are, yes, they are collectively oriented. They have led, they've been ahead they've probably been ahead of the government right throughout in the UK setting. And I think also actually elsewhere in the world that the governments are having to catch up with public sentiment on this. But the risk, I think, is to articulate a version of the public as being encapsulated by nation state. I think that's very problematic. As being communitarian, again, risky stuff. And I think we need to keep a critical lens on this, which is that the public do have a sense of solidarity with each other, but we need to be careful of the frames that we put around that solidarity. And that's where I would probably caution. I noticed Steve using the word nation a lot. I'm less keen on that. I think what we find in our homework and analysing the analytical category of home is that people are quite transnational in their understanding. And I expect when people do work on this pandemic, once things slow down a bit, that you will see that people who are making their decisions, and we are an I as well as a we, we make decisions as dialogical selves every day, lots of mundane decisions, but we may well be having a chat with someone who's in another country, and I want to propose a more transnational framing of that. Oh, a couple more questions coming in then. Yeah. So a question then coming from, let's take the question then from Rose. This is a question for Simon. Simon, you refer to birthright discourse for incomers. However, in recent years, there's been various attempts to undermine this right, most notably with young people in relation to ISIS. Has this been coming up in your research? And if so, how are participants managing this new discourse where citizenship can be taken away, even in a great question, even if you were born in the UK?
Yeah, okay, now that's a really good point. I've got to say that's not something I've given any thought to, actually. It's not something I've come across in relation to any of the issues I've been looking at. But you're right, absolutely. And yeah, I'm thinking with those kind of the ISIS bride, she's called, and yeah, very much about taking away citizenship from people born in this country. So I think that's a really good point. That's something to look into. So yeah, I don't think I've got a more.
Yeah, and I'm conscious of time as well. So let's just take another question. This is from Jean. Hey, Jean. Great that you're here. And Jean's asking this question. I'm assuming a radical transition disruption to sense of self, other, location, etc. following the pandemic, although not assuming a clear end to the pandemic, by the way. Do you have a sense of the threats, risks societally and individually, and in particular, the kinds of interventions we might need from social science? So, a view on that, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, it is something I've given some thought to, and I have no answers for this. But what has occurred to me is how much this kind of lays bare some of the real inequalities. So in two aspects, there's massive inequalities in terms of who's being affected by this. So we know, in a whole number of ways, a whole number of different kind of metrics. So poorer people are coming off worse, minorities are coming off worse, men are coming off worse, which isn't often the case, but it's the case here. Older people are coming off worse, people with disabilities are coming off worse. And I think a really big distinction around who now has to go back to work kind of physically, which tends to be much lower paid jobs, and who gets to stay safely at home, which tends to be the better paid jobs. So I think that there's massive implications for inequalities there, which really need to be understood. And also I think what's going to happen in the result of the lockdown itself, which is going to lead to new inequalities, I think particularly around who's going to lose their jobs, and the resulting recession that's obviously going to happen as a result of this. So I think that's going to we're going to have further disparities there as well. So a huge social psychological component to this around all those different levels of inequalities, and I've probably missed some as well. So lots to cover there, but I think that's something that we need to be thinking about, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I've read a few articles that have been produced in the last few months saying, an end to populism, that one of the things, Jean, is that this pandemic has shown up populist leaders as being completely unable to navigate it. The Bolsonaro, Trump, Johnson are all this form of kind of masculinity, or sometimes called toxic masculinity, really has not worked for the pandemic. And also the other interesting thing for populism studies is that usually populism squashes down expertise, and we saw that in Brexit, and that the people need to use their common sense. They don't need experts. But actually, this pandemic has flipped that round. We really need our experts. We want experts now, and we're able to use experts in order to engage in decision making. So that's what's going on during the pandemic. However, I personally, partly because I'm a very, I can see the foreshadowing, I think, of futures in this scenario. I think once we get to the economic austerity that Simon's talking about, I think we will have a return to populist leaders. It may not be the same ones, and they may use expertise in a different way, and that's called techno-populism, where they use technological expertise. So they will play expertise in. It's back to Steve Reicher and this idea of being instrumentalized. The key thing for experts, social scientists, is to be careful about how you're being instrumentalized, and to be careful how because data will be used in the new form of populism quite publicly. It's going to be used. And I really do think that what we can do in terms of your challenge for us, Jean, is I think we need to look at where those binaries are. And one of the things I noticed that when Anthony and Sue and I were working on this paper was that actually academia really doesn't help populism at all. It's very happy to use binaries in its research. It will do research on migrants, or it will do research on the public who are then cast as being not migrant, and so on. And the more we can be brave about doing research which is dynamic, relational epistemologies, qualitative, and it will take bravery under economic austerity and contraction to do that, but the more that we can do work that presents people as full-bodied, complicated and multi-voiced within right across social science, and take on techno-populism with our own technological capacities to speak about how the people actually are, the more we are going to break down those binaries. The real challenge for social science is how we ourselves, I think, use binaries. So that's my speech.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running a bit out of time. But
Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending our session.
Thank you everyone. Yeah.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks for that. Bye. Bye.